Well, shoot. Excited about this. CNFers promotional support for the Creative Nonfiction Podcast is provided by the Power of Narrative Conference out of Boston, Massachusetts. It's a craft conference focusing on a genre near and dear to my heart, narrative journalism, taking place March 22nd and 23rd at Boston University. I attended a few years ago, and it's a great time. You got like 1 week, dude. 1 week. 300 to 400 journalists from around the world will descend on Boston University, and you can be one of them. Sure can. Visit calmbeyond.bu.edu. Navigate to the Power of Narrative conference page, and when you register, use the code narrative25, and you'll save 25%. This year's keynote speakers include former New York Times editor Dean Baquet, NPR White House correspondent Asma Khalid, The Washington Post John Woodrow Cox, former WAPO editor Marty Barron, and the team behind the Boston Globe's Murder in Boston, the untold story of the Charles and Carol Stewart shooting. Not only that, but there's going to be 15 breakout sessions and crafting climate change stories or writing braided narratives and the power of empathy in reporting. Learn more at calmbeyond.bu.edu and use narrative25 at checkout. Again, narrative25 to save 25% at calmbeyond.bu.edu. Repairing, restoring, reconnecting through true storytelling. I dig that.
Say it once and get the fuck out of there.
Oh, hey, CNFers, it's the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, the show where I speak to primarily badass writers about the art of telling true stories. I'm Brendan O'Mara. Hey, I'm not thrilled I'm the host of the show either. We can't all be Max Linsky or some shit. Okay, but listen, though. Elizabeth Rush is back for her third rodeo. This was recorded back in November, so we're nothing if not punctual here, and her book is probably closer to paperback than hardback, but whatever, okay, man? The name of her book is The Quickening, Creation and Community at the Ends of the Earth. It is published by Milkweed. Her first book, Rising Dispatches from the New American Shore, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. She didn't win, but I'll come out and say being a finalist is as good as winning. Take it from someone who's never won anything. Show notes to this episode and more at BrendanO'Mara.com, where you can sign up for my monthly Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter. It's a toe tap and good read. Very biased. First of the month, no spam, as far as I can tell. I can't beat it. For now, keep the conversation going on Instagram and Threads at Creative Nonfiction Podcast. And consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/CNFpod. I get it. Money's tight, dude. And the joy you get from, say, just having a $4 coffee often is far more gratifying than $4 a month on your favorite podcast. But if you can, check it out. I just put out a call for office hours to talk about whatever you want to talk about. It happens to be for the $4 and up crowd. And it's a little thing I do, maybe quarterly, kind of do that. You want to hash something out, you can hash it out on me. Elizabeth can be found at elizabethrush.net. Not com, not org, not gov, net. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Orion, Guernica, and she teaches creative nonfiction, the subject, not the podcast, at Brown University. I once drove to an open major league tryout at Brown University in 1998, but I got lost in Providence, Rhode Island, and I was super depressed anyway, didn't really want to go, and I missed the tryout and drove home. My dad was not happy. In this conversation, Liz talks about how she tries to sometimes lyric her way out of problems, the voice, the slippery nature of voice, and being a character in her own work, and giving her sources a chance to not be on, which is kind of a good concept, especially when you're talking to maybe people who aren't used to being covered, like the scientists she was shadowing while on a giant boat circumventing Antarctica and visiting the Thwaites Glacier. Amazing stuff. Anyway, Enjoy, CNFers. Stay tuned to the end of the show for a parting shot about cutting a book's worth of words from a book and still being able to call it a book. Riff. I was reading this on Brain Pickings or Marginalian about this great little post about Kurt Vonnegut and writing and style. And there are several bullet points that Vonnegut talks about. And I think this might be kind of fun to spit out these bullet points and have you kind of riff on them, because there are a lot of things that are just congruent thematically with this little post and what I like to talk about on the show. And I think this might be kind of cool to get your insights into some of this thing with kind of writing and style. And like his first point is find a subject you care about. And and I think this might be a good place to even just pull in the quickening for this and how that came to pass, why it was a subject you cared about in terms of its backdrop, but there's also the greater subtext of motherhood that is congruent also with the book. So maybe just riff on like finding a subject you care about and the importance of that, really.
So I teach writing also, and something I always tell my students is exactly that. Like, you want to be writing in a space where you have a lot of curiosity and interest, because at the end of the day, like, writing's not going to make you rich. It's not going to make you famous. What it can give you is like a considered life and time and space to like really probe, your interests deeply and figure out what makes them fire and why. And that's like the reward. It's not all the other things that we tend to think about as being like actual rewards. So definitely start with something that you care about. For me, my most recent book is really about Antarctica, climate change, and motherhood. And the starting point for me was I had spent, half a decade in coastal communities in the United States that were being transformed by higher tides and stronger storms. And there was like a certain amount of uncertainty that I had to learn to live with. Like, are you going to get 3 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century or six? No one really knows. And you have to be comfortable with that uncertainty. But then I read an article about this glacier in West Antarctica that is the size of Florida, that no human beings had ever been to the place where it discharges ice into the sea. So we really don't know much about how it's behaving, how it will behave. But it contains enough ice to raise global sea levels 2 feet, and it's a kind of quirk to the West Antarctic ice sheet, which, if we lose that, will raise global sea levels 10 feet or more. And apparently, like when I read about it, we know so little about this place that they don't even include it in a lot of, at the time, they didn't include it in a lot of sea level rise models because there was just no way to accurately do that. And so I was fascinated by the idea that there's a place on the planet that is already profoundly transforming us, but that we don't even know well enough to like understand what it's up to and what it might do in the future. That was just like fascinating to me. So I applied for a grant to go there, and through the National Science Foundation, and I got it. And then I found out that in order to be part of this like scientific mission, I had to pass a series of like physical tests, and one of them was I had to like prove that I wasn't pregnant, because pregnant people aren't allowed to deploy to the ice on these government run icebreakers. And I wanted to get pregnant around that time, but in order to go on the mission I had to postpone those plans like one full year. And I was 35. I was, postponing plans to get pregnant one full year meant that were I to get pregnant when I came back, I would be a geriatric pregnancy technically. And it just seemed to me like, oh, these two things that I'm really interested in, one that's like grounded in creation and the other that's grounded in disintegration, are really intimately tied to one another in my life in ways that I like didn't fully understand. And so the book is kind of written from the place of trying to hold these two desires alongside one another to see what they do to one another.
Lots to unpack, but we'll keep going down this Vonnegutian list, and we'll circle back to some of those topics for sure. So step 2 is do not ramble, though. So
Like, did I just ramble? I hope not.
no. It's all he has to say on that is like, I won't ramble on about that. But it does get to concision and being probably ruthless with your language once you're rewriting.
Am I allowed to swear on your show?
Hell yeah.
Okay. So, at some point in the semester with my students, I give them my like top 10 tips for revision. And tip number 1 is like read your work out loud. Always read your work out loud. Edit in real time. Your ear is a better editor than your eye. And I think tip number like 3 or 4 is say it once and get the fuck out of there. Which I think could be translated to do not ramble. No one wants to hear you say the same thing 7 times sideways. So I won't ramble on about it either, but don't repeat yourself.
Strangely enough, the few times that I'm interviewed or people ask me questions, that's something I have to get very much better about. I have a tendency to be far too long-winded and often repeat myself 2 or 3 times, and it's like, dude, like even just speaking, it's like get out of your own way. You know, brevity is your friend. You know, whether it be speaking or in writing, right?
I mean, I think it's way harder to do in speaking. I'm sort
Right?
of
Yeah.
shocked and embarrassed when I listen to myself talk because I do think I think of it as like exactitude on the page. I edit towards exactitude. When I speak, I don't get the privilege of working something over like 17 times before I make it public. So some of that exactitude disappears. Sort of painful to to
Yeah.
encounter a recording.
Well, I think people like us who do journalism, and we know what it's like to talk to someone who is very hard to talk to or is a tough nut to crack and just doesn't talk. So there might be some. I know I'm pretty self conscious about that. Like if someone has the courtesy to ask me questions, I want to at least give them more than they bargained for. So it's like you can cut down whatever the hell I'm saying, but at least I'm going to show up and give you something instead of being like, yeah, I agree with that. Next question, or I don't know, didn't really think about it. It's like, no, well, yeah, here you go. Here's a bunch. Just gonna vomit. Take what you want.
I mean, that's the kind of drafter I am too. I'm a vomit drafter, and you, I have senior thesis students right now, and they're kind of in that painful place of like, I made a bunch of stuff, but it's not good yet. And I was like, yeah, it stinks to have to sit in that place for a while, but you just keep producing stuff, and then we'll get into revision, and then we'll get into revising the revision, and then we'll get into revising the revision of the revision, and then you'll start to feel better about things.
And that kind of reminds me just the cadence of what you just said, like from our first conversation. It's one soundbite I pulled out for a presentation I did at Hippocamp, a creative nonfiction conference a couple years ago, and you're like, I'm just a mule. I'm just slowly plodding up that hill. Get as you're going through your draft, and I just always love that image of how slow and methodical it can be. It's just like I'm just a mule.
I remember saying that to you, and I actually have said that since in like many other conversations. Yeah, you just got to walk slowly up an absolutely gigantic mountain, and show up for the work of it. It's not particularly glamorous.
And the next one is keep it simple.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that makes me think, George Orwell has it somewhere in Politics in the English Language where, or no, it's Drunk and White. I don't know. It's one of the two. Uh, you know, or it's Lee Gutkin. God, who knows? Um, but
If I'm being honest here, I didn't exactly Google to see who said that exactly, but it's a common sentiment among the literati to use to favor clarity over verbosity. And another way of saying that is don't get writerly on me, which is something that's always in my ear, a little bug in my ear. And maybe we need to stop teaching examples that are, quote, writerly, because we end up mimicking it and then we suck and then we're told, this isn't the way you do it. You should do it this way, and this way is often better. But it's just like the foundation on which you're building all your insecurities is over here, and then fuck.
Don't use a $5 word when a $1 word will suffice. When I was a younger writer, I'm still sort of young, but not super young. When I was a younger writer, I think I confused fancy words with style. Like if I put in enough fancy words, my writing would have style. And I think that style is actually kind of the opposite. It's like what and voice. Like who am I without the fancy words? What happens if I try to say this in plain language? And I'm laughing at myself because I think sometimes the kind of writer that I am, I will like, I think of it as lyric my way out of a problem. Like I won't know exactly what I'm trying to say, so I will make the language beautiful and transfixing, and I will hide behind that affect, that like patina that I've put on the language because I know that I can do it. Like I'm trained as a poet first. I know how to I know how to like through revision make a sentence that sings, but does it say anything? Sometimes I I sometimes I make it sing so I precisely don't have to solve the problem of what it wants to say. And that's when you like need a good editor to be like, hey, come back to this. What do you actually mean? At least that's true in nonfiction. So keep it simple.
Yeah, and so I'm going to skip 4. We're going to come back to 4, but on 5, because this is pretty germane, it's sound like yourself. And it gets to style, and yeah, sometimes we conflate style with these pyrotechnics, but oftentimes, at least in my opinion, style is about or reveals itself in what you pay attention to also.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a really good point. There's like, I have a really talented student right now in one of my workshops who I've worked with on and off for a couple years. And he has lately been sort of concerned with voice. Like everyone's like, find your voice. What's your voice? And I said to him, I'm not sure if this will be helpful for you to hear, but I don't think I found my voice until I was like 30. And finding my voice had as much to do with finding the forms that I was interested in working in and also finding the subjects that like most bring me and my writing mind alive, and finding like sort of the like linguistic register. But I think that third part, that thing that we think of as being like defining of the writer, for me didn't click into place until form and content had clicked into place. So, I didn't really start like writing in a way that was deeply grounded in nature until, and like consistently at sort of the nexus of like human built society and the more than human world until I was like 30. I really wasn't having listening as central to my writing practice until then either, or really bringing the voices of my interviewees into my work until then. So, I was 5 years out of an MFA program at that point and a decade out of my undergrad work before I think I found my style or my voice. But that whole decade, I was still writing and still doing work, you know, for other people, for myself, and all that was like part of the process.
Voice is really slippery, and it's hard to get your head around. A lot of people struggle with it, like your students, and it doesn't matter how old you are. A lot of people really struggle with this. Like they have to like emerge fully formed right away, and this is who I am. Bang. Whereas it really is just this very slow Polaroid picture developing thing. It doesn't just happen overnight. It really emerges and develops over time, and suddenly, after years of doing it, it's like, oh, well, there it is. But it didn't just emerge, and I think people really want it to just emerge.
Totally. They want to be like, I wrote a poem and this poem has my voice.
Boom, boom,
Yeah.
just like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I love your metaphor. It's like a very dilated development of a Polaroid picture.
And then we come to say what you mean to say. I like that one.
I mean, you're just making me think about it's making me think about things that I'm sitting in my office at work and things that I say in this office a lot and that I have to remind myself of regularly. Let's put it this way, like I will often be having a conversation with someone about their work or a conversation with myself about my work. And if there's a section that's unclear, I will ask like what are you trying to say here? And usually the person will just spit it out and I write it down exactly as they said it and I hand it to them and I'm like, there, go put that in the piece. And sometimes I'll like do that exercise with myself as I'm editing something. If I know I've lyricked my way out of a problem or I've gotten cloudy in my thinking or I have a note that's like, this is confusing. I will sometimes make like an audio recording in my voice memos of my phone where I just try to explain what I'm actually trying to do or what I mean and then I'll transcribe that recording and usually use some of that exact language in the revision.
And this one's good. This is actually a really good name for a podcast title. Pity the readers.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Eventually, it's got to land on. It lands in someone's hands. It lands on their ears as an audiobook. Eventually, what we're doing is trying to communicate something to a reader, and that's we always need to be mindful of that. Maybe not too early in the process, but eventually, we do need to pity the reader.
Totally. I think even more so nowadays, like think about just how profoundly our attentions are like split and fractured and there's shit vying for them all the time. Like you have to understand that your reader exists in a world where like attention unfortunately is money. How are you going to like break through and draw their attention towards this thing that's really curious and interesting to you, but you have to like meet them in some middle ground, and not just think that your interest is going to like carry them through your text. Like you really have to think about what can spark their interest. Sometimes I'm very much a character in my own work, and that's not because I think I'm like profoundly interesting. The I that's a character in my work is really there for the reader. Is there for like sense that the reader gets to know someone like a real human being with an incredible amount of like intimacy and that you get a little bit of a voyeuristic glimpse into their life and that they're gonna also only include details that are relevant to the subject matter that they're exploring. So I'm not telling someone like everything on my shopping list, right? I'm editing most of that stuff out and trying to be like a good judge of the kinds of intense personal details that can fire up that voyeuristic side of a reader while also helping them like better understand the subject at hand.
And lastly, and you've alluded to it before and kind of alluded to it just now, is have the guts to cut. And yeah, that is so true. Even if it's good stuff, you have to cut. It's just to reduce the sauce.
Totally. I think of like the person who turned me into a writer was a woman named Katie Ford. She's a poet and she was my senior thesis advisor at Reed College. And I remember I worked on like these poems all summer long. In our first thesis meeting, I had sent her like 10 poems and she handed them back to me. And I think she would be slightly mortified to hear she said this to me, but I've told it to her face. So she's like, "Oh yeah, that I did say that." She handed me back the poems and literally said to me, "This isn't poetry." And I was like, "Oh, well,
Oh
I mean,
boy.
I think it's my poetry. I've been like trying really hard to make something." And what she did over the subsequent months was we met once a week and she sat down next to me and she had this kind of like thick black felt tip pen and she would just go through my poems and cut out like 50-60% of the language in them. And what she would leave in her wake was so much stronger than what I had passed to her. And she did that exercise with me again and again and again and again until I kind of learned how to do it myself. To me, that was just like literally the turning point in becoming a writer, was learning that I could make something stronger by leaving it out.
What are the looks on your students' faces when you similarly gut the shit out of whatever it is they turn in?
I don't use her black felt tip marker. Um, and I don't cross things out. I use a trick from William Zinsser. I put brackets around stuff. And I have like a proofreading paper that I hand out very early in the semester with all my like marginalia notes. And the note next to the brackets, anything that's inside brackets is an area that I would consider cutting. The rule of thumb that I tend to do, because I don't work with poetry, I work with creative nonfiction essays, is I will bracket the first like 2 pages of a text, but then I want the student to kind of take over and do some of that work themselves. And oh, what is the look on their faces? I mean, sometimes there's like a little bit of devastation. Like they look at me like, oh, I did it wrong.
Mm, mm.
And then I read to them just like out loud the first paragraph with the stuff that I bracketed omitted. And there's like another look on their face, which is like, holy shit, that sounds good. And so I think they then get excited about it and they realize that it's just part of the process and you can't be precious and hold on to things and you didn't do anything wrong. It's in fact exactly correct. You just have to now take the next step, which is moving towards exactitude.
Mm. Yeah, and moving towards exactitude, let's say with the quickening, so you apply for this grant and you get this access, this trip to go to the Doomsday Glacier, the Thwaites Glacier. And am I saying that right? Thwaites?
Thwaites, like it's a little bit more like thwaites.
Okay.
Yep.
So so you get you get that access, and it's at a time where you're considering becoming a mom. And at what point over the course of, say, that project did you realize that those subjects were going to merge and intersect?
I think what happened was that because I really had to put off pregnancy to go on the trip, they were already intersecting in my life. Early on, it felt like maybe that intersection was arbitrary or I was like inventing its importance. But the more research I did, the more profoundly I understood sort of like the heteromasculine narratives that have been sprayed all over the Antarctic continent, the more committed I became to not keeping these subjects separate from one another. And then the challenge was not to project my preconceived notions of how they influenced one another onto the ice, but to kind of remain open to and receptive to the reality that I might like learn something by carrying them together in the same bag for or like vessel for a long time. I think there were multiple times where I had to kind of check myself and be like, "Oh, you like came up with this idea before you ever even saw the glacier. Like, did that actually hold up when you got there? If not, what happened? And if what happened was unclear, how can you talk about what was confusing?"
And at what point does the title hit you in its double meaning?
Ooh, late, really late. For the longest time, this book was called The Mother of All Things. And I never loved it, in part because it felt a little too ambitious. I was like, the mother of all things. Like, there's some part of me that was like, I don't want to say anything is the mother of all things. Like, I just don't think I have the authority to do that. And it was, I was doing this thing where I was turning Antarctica into a mother from afar without really. I feel like that was a kind of thinking that I had in my head before I even went on the trip. Yeah, I mean, I want to say it was like 6 months before publication that the quickening occurred to me as the title. And I was a little bit like, right, quickening means two things. It's sort of like to quicken, as in to accelerate the way that the glaciers are accelerating because they're moving more with more speed than human beings have ever before recorded because we're forcing change into them. And it's also kind of to spring to life. The moment when you first feel your baby move is the quickening of a pregnancy. And before we had ultrasounds, that's like how you knew you were pregnant. Quite late in the game. Um, but that's how you could kind of confirm that the baby was alive. And I think those two definitions, like especially the quickening, I think Antarctica's glaciers are quickening in that second sense of the word right now. They're springing to life and showing us their animacy. How would I put it? My first book, Rising, also has a kind of like double entendre title, as in rising sea levels, but also like rising into awareness and rising into power. And I guess that's just a thing I like to do. There was a brief moment where I was like, "Oh, is this too similar in how it works to the title of Rising?" But I like how concise it is, and I like how it asks us to think about sort of like the possibilities and embedded in the language that we use.
So this book has something of kind of a three-prongish structure. It's like you the in Antarctica on the boat, uh, and then there's your meditations, usually back on the mainland about motherhood, conceiving and thinking about that, and then there are these kind of like oral history type breakaways or breakout sessions that are kind of thematically driven too, based on what you've been writing about. So, how did you arrive at that particular structure for this book?
Ooh, I like this question. So when I went, when I signed up to go on the mission, I knew that women's stories had been left out of Antarctic storytelling and that the stories of laborers on the vessels or in the research bases had also largely been left out of Antarctic storytelling. And those people are often people of color, not always, but there's, the Antarctic canon is very white. But there are people of color who go to the ice predominantly in support roles. So I knew going into the mission that I like wanted to highlight these other stories, these other experiences of the ice. And interviewing has always been really central to my writing practice. So from day one, even before the cruise set sail, I was calling my shipmates and regularly interviewing them about what they were doing to prepare and uh everything from science related stuff to work related stuff to personal related stuff. While I was on the boat, I did 213 interviews.
Mm.
I transcribed them all by hand on board. So there was no transcription software because we had no internet. And
Woof.
I knew that,
Oh.
like, yeah, it was such a heavy lift. I would tend to do, like, let's say 3 interviews a day, and those would be, like, 20 to 30 minutes long, sometimes a little bit longer. And then I would have to spend, 2 to 3 times that amount of time transcribing them. So I spent an ungodly amount of time in Antarctica, like, in the lowest deck on the boat transcribing interviews. Um, and I knew, but I was like making the archive. I knew I was making the thing that was going to make the book. I just didn't know how I was going to use them yet or how the voices were going to come in. And I was really inspired by Ilya Kaminsky's Deaf Republic. He's a poet who I love, who wrote this really amazing book during the Trump presidency about, it's an imaginary community living under a dictatorship that invents their own language to their own sign language to like resist the dictatorship and the like oppressive regime ultimately ends up killing like a young deaf boy in this community, and you follow the people around him leading up to his death and then after his death. And like there are very specific characters in the book, and he opens with a kind of cast of characters where you get to know each of the different people who are going to be at play in this like lyric narrative poem. You get little descriptions of them, and what that did for me was like it somehow, as I was reading, made me see the individual characters not as an invention of Ilya Kaminsky, but as like people in their own right. They felt sort of fully formed. And I basically stole that idea from him. I was like, okay, I'm going to do a cast of characters at the start. And then I decided to use the transcriptions to create these sections of text that look sort of like a screenplay where the different individual speakers kind of talk directly to the reader. That's how it came about.
I love hearing you say, as you were transcribing things, of making the archive from which this book will eventually derive from. I really like that idea of you're making this master library through which that you're going to synthesize this book, but it's like you have to create the archive yourself. It's kind of a wild image of like conjuring, so then you can cast a spell.
Totally. Totally. And it's like, okay, if these voices are missing, like I got to figure out how to capture them as it's happening because otherwise they'll like get disappeared. They won't appear in the official record. So I felt like that was like where the labor began. That was really exciting to me. It was a really exciting time to be on that boat.
Yeah, there's a moment early in the book where you write. This is one of those sections where you're like just thinking about being a mom and so forth, and you ask what if by having a child I destroy the possibility of ever truly being alone. And I wanted to
Mm,
get a sense of what your relationship is to solo time, even loneliness, and maybe how that has changed now since you have since given birth to your son and are now 6 months pregnant with another?
Ooh, you know, it's complicated. I have always I am at the end of the day an introvert, and I do recharge, you know, by being alone, and often for me by being alone for like long periods of time. And ideally, some of that time is like spent outside moving my body. Uh and I very recently, so I've been on book tour all fall, which meant that I have like left my husband and my son behind. But all of that travel is always done, with work. And a lot of, shockingly, like we ask writers to do so many different things that require so many different skill sets. Like, we want you to be great at spending years by yourself in front of a computer in a room. And we want you to be able to go on the road and like put on a road show and
Yeah.
talk to a bunch of people and be really engaging and entertaining. Like, you're supposed to be an entertainer at some level. So I spent the whole fall basically leaving home like once a week to go do some kind of public facing event. And 2 weekends ago, my husband and I were scheduled to go visit with his family in New Jersey. And I looked at him very last minute and said, would it be okay if I don't come? And I was like, if I could stay home, it would be a great gift that you are giving me. And so my husband and son went to New Jersey, and I stayed home for 3 days. And I swear to God, it was like the first time I've heard myself think in 3 years. And I was like, oh, I have thoughts. Oh, that's lovely. Like, I'm going to stand in the shower and look at the curtain rings and like think about this thing that's totally unrelated. And I went for some hikes and I did some yoga, but there was just time and space to literally encounter myself thinking again. And I have definitely been feeling a little bit like my well is feeling a little dry. I have a new book that I'm excited to start working on, but I've been pretty resistant to like jumping full in just because I want a little bit of, I just need to kind of like re encounter myself as a writer. And to do that, I actually need space and time alone. So, crazy time. There's another baby coming, but we also have sabbatical coming up. And we'll spend our sabbatical in Colombia, where my husband is from. And we have the incredible privilege to have help with childcare in Colombia. So I'm hoping that I can get a little bit more of that time alone as needed in the next year, even though I will also have a newborn. We'll see.
And part of the book too is you thinking about the environmental impact on bringing new humans into the world, and even if bringing then taking the step, bringing them into the world, and then what kind of world are they inheriting? And that's something you meditate on quite a bit through the book. And there's a moment too where you bring up the PR campaign of British Petroleum and how they put in like something like $100 million to really essentially guilt the individual into taking on the burden of cleaning up the planet. It's something big corporations do, and it's capitalistically driven to then outsource that guilt onto the individual. And I just wanted to get you to just expand on that, because we see it not just in climate related things, but there's just any number of things that big companies love to outsource the thing to the individual when it's really big systems that need the most change.
Totally. I mean, I read an article by me and Chris, who has since become a friend, actually, which is just lovely. I love how that happens when you're a writer. You sometimes read an article that changes your entire universe, and then the powers that be kind of throw you into the same spaces again and again, and a friendship forms, which is really awesome. She wrote this article that just said exactly kind of what you're talking about. where she charted how British Petroleum purposely popularized the carbon footprint, and in particular, carbon footprint calculators, as a way to tabulate the impact your individual life has on the planet. And then sometimes they make suggestions for like what you can do to be a better citizen, like one less flight or go vegan. And I had long been sort of skeptical of those calculators because they often put kids, like choosing to have a child, often appears in these calculators. And then, they not surprisingly will spit out a number like, that's 20 times more impactful than buying a car. And I just fundamentally disagree with the idea that choosing to have a kid and buying a car are the same kind of choice. Like, a kid is not a consumer product that you pull off the shelf and like self scan at the Target. So that sense of sort of offloading guilt and shame onto the individual is something they were really interested in fostering to lead us to places of, moral quandary and indecision in the supermarket aisles. And all of that gets in the way of organizing in a more methodical way to end the expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure, um, to advocate for the transition to renewable energy sources, all of that. So they've been really successful, and yet I think we're slowly kind of waking up to the fact that true climate action is sort of collective action and means fundamentally shifting the systems through which our energy is supplied. At some level, when I found out this stuff, I was like, get out of my uterus. You're not allowed to make decisions around whether or not I get to be a mother. Like, BP doesn't get to influence that. And so it was very clarifying information for me.
When you were, on the boat and shadowing the researchers and the crew, how did you navigate not being intrusive, but also trying to be there to absorb whatever information that you wanted to fill up a notebook with so that you could write something and and know that, like, oh shit, like, here, Liz is over there. All right, watch what you say, guys. Or like, shit, like, I just want to have my head down in my work here, and that, here she comes. She's probably gonna start asking us shit.
Uh, oh, yeah. So it took me like something that I didn't realize until I had been on the boat for like a week or two was that I was the writer in residence on board, and I had to apply for that position through the NSF and get a specific grant for it. Then there were two journalists on board who were brought in sort of independent of the NSF's grant process because the National Science Foundation wanted publicity for this mission. And it took me like a couple weeks to figure out that none of the crew or scientists had been asked if they were okay with this kind of attention on their work. It's not the norm. And as I learned that, I could see that like some scientists were taxed by feeling like they constantly had to be on. And so I started to like work with people to try to set ground rules, like what you stay in the mess hall stays in the mess hall. No interviewing in our cabins. More so than any other time in my life, was really rigorous about any time I turned on my recording device. I would say like, I'm recording now. Can I have your consent? Just so they knew that like now they were on, if that makes sense. Because it felt to me, and I totally got it, really important that they have space to not be on. And then I also said, we're going to do all these interviews. If you choose to be part of them, you don't have to choose to be part of them. And at the end, I'm going to write a book. And I promise that I will send you like a illuminated manuscript deep into the drafting process where I highlight everything that you say and you get to review it and potentially change it if you're not happy with something you said. So I want to kind of let you know that you're not going to lose agency over your words at this moment of this interchange, because that happens a lot with this kind of reporting where you say something and then, like, 6 months later it appears in an article and you're like, oh yeah, okay. And like, I don't like the way I sound off the top of my head, so I can't expect everyone else to just get behind that.
Yeah.
I tried to be really forthcoming in this way. And I also tried to help out. Like, I tried to say, like, you're going to do interviews for me. Can I help you label sample bags or dig for ancient penguin bones, or, make this like a two-way street as opposed to just me taking from you. And I think all of that really worked to the overall advantage of making the book. And I did. I mean, I made good on all my promises. About It was January before the manuscript was due. So January of 2022, about 10, 12 months before the final manuscript was due, I started sending out those illuminated texts to the different interviewees. And it was really wonderful. I was so pleased. Most people didn't push back much at all. And the thing that and I mean that not like in a, I don't know. Most people just, I was getting the science right. I was getting the story right. There wasn't a lot of like, you misunderstood this concept or whatever. And that's great. The thing that most people wanted to change was how they talked about their mothers, because I asked everyone to tell me the story of their births. Those were changes that I could make, no skin off my back, and get the manuscript to a place that the person speaking is happy with and wants to share it with their parents or wants to share it with partners and family. Um, so it all worked out, but it was, let's put it this way, like, thoughtful from day one and years in the making, and a lot of extra labor went into it.
Yeah, and speaking of you trying to be of use, there's the moment too where you drop one of the cores, and take us to that moment of when that happens.
Oh gosh. Funnily, I have heard from a lot of readers that they love this part of the book. And yeah, I was helping. I was like a field aide in the data collection process. And it was the day after we arrived at Thwaites. A ton of material had come on board in the nighttime, and I just volunteered to help process the data, which meant like scooping mud out of a big metal tube and putting it in plastic bags and cleaning the utensils and doing that kind of thing like on repeat for 15, 16 hours straight. And very late in that day, I made a grave error where I didn't hold the supporter cork in the bottom of a megacore, is what it's called. And so, 30 inches of glacial sediment dragged up from the ocean floor from right in front of the weights, just like splatted out onto the lab floor and like trickled away. And I can still see that mud and feel the like, I literally like started sweating profusely and my mouth got dry and I was like, "Oh my god, I messed up big time." It was the most ashamed I've been as an adult. Like, it was awful. And then I went to each of the individual researchers on that team and had to apologize to them and say I lost this really important data. And what was fascinating was also sort of the aftermath of that, because someone said to me, this is Antarctic science. Mistakes happen all the time. You lost 10% of the data, but if you moan about it, you're going to lose 20, meaning like every minute, every hour counts. So we just have to like keep going. And that was fascinating to me. It was like I had to be
Mm.
really accountable for my actions. And then I just had to keep working. And I think there's something really important that we can learn about sort of like the fight for climate justice. It's like we're all making this stuff up as we go along, and errors will be made. It's how you deal with them that matters.
And there's a moment in the book also where the glacier, calves a big section into the ocean, which is a really dramatic moment and I imagine beautiful to witness, but it's got to be on some level like it's something you don't want to see, but you also want to see. Maybe you can kind of take us to that dichotomy there in that sense.
Right. Before I ever went on the mission, I in part to like write a grant proposal to write about glaciers, I watched a really important clip, a video clip from a documentary called Chasing Ice, which shows the Jakobshoven Glacier in Greenland retreating really rapidly over the course of like 2 minutes. It just kind of crumbles and falls apart, a big chunk of it. And that I watched that glacier fall apart multiple times because it's like that video is the only visual record human beings have as of that moment in time of like a glacier moving really quickly. And Jakobshoven is like one of the fastest retreating glaciers in the world. And it's really violent. Like the clip itself, you see like gigantic chunks of ice, like the size of skyscrapers, falling off the front of this glacial like tongue. And so in my mind, if we saw Thwaites fall apart, it was going to look like that. And we were there. And in fact, Thwaites, a huge chunk of Thwaites, 25 times bigger than the, chunk that fell apart at Jakobshoven in that clip, fell apart all around us. And it was of such a scale, like it was so big, it kind of just like broke off into pieces that then drifted away from the ice front. And so I had never anticipated that a collapse could be bigger than what had been previously recorded, and that it would be so big that I actually couldn't really see it, if that makes sense. So indeed, we did witness this calving event, but it never like resonated in my body as really violent because my body was sort of like the wrong barometer. It couldn't totally grasp what was happening, which was also really unsettling.
Well, very nice. Well, Elizabeth, I want to be mindful of your time, and this is great to kind of talk about the writing of the book and some of its internal musculature, and it's such a great book, and it's so great to see you go from from Rising to this one, and I can only imagine what the third one will bring. Um, so as I bring these conversations down for a landing, I think this is different from the last time you were on. I like asking the guests for a recommendation of some kind for the listeners, and that can just be anything you want, anything you're excited about. And so I'll just pose that to you, Elizabeth. If what would you
Ooh,
recommend?
I totally have an answer to this. I recently read a book that I loved called Kick the Latch by Catherine Scanlon. And um it's technically a fiction, but it is based on years of interviewing a horse trainer at sort of like B grade racetracks in the United States. It's a female horse trainer. And it's got to be like a series of like 50 very short vignettes uh, that are all recounted entirely in her voice. Or at least the recounting comes from these interviews, and it's like a very vocal piece where you feel like you're kind of getting inside the contours of this very, very particular human being. I adored it. You should have her on if you haven't. I'm just like fan number one. I think I recommended it 18 times this month.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, I'll have to look into that for sure. Liz. Makes me feel good. She's a joy to listen to. I love talking to her. Thank you, CNFers, for listening, and thanks to the Power of Narrative Conference for the promotional support. This is your last chance in 2024 to get your 25% off discount by going to combeyond.bu.edu and using Narrative 25 for some extra book money or burrito money, or let's be honest, if you're me, beer money. Okay, so by the time you hear this, I've got one fucking month to my big deadline. I've largely been mum about this whole process because I just don't have much to say that won't sound profoundly boring. I also recognize my great privilege through this process, so I don't want to complain too much, though, humble listener, you're probably like, all I've heard you do is complain this last year. I haven't had to find a day job during the writing, so I recognize how lucky I am. Well, most likely, I'm thinking after this process is done, I'll probably have to bartend. It seems like a good calling for me. I'm good at conversation. Well, I'm good at allowing conversation to happen to me. I'm not a good conversationalist, but I bring the conversationalist out of people who are across from me. Anyway, you make more money bartending than being a writer, that's for sure. Got my first round of edits through just like the first 100-ish pages of the book because we got a fucking hustle through the first 13 chapters or so, and they are generous. And by generous, it does not mean nice. I can hear how annoyed I make my editor. Like maybe I'm projecting. I always project. It's a character flaw. Deal with it. I have to cut a minimum of 57,000 words. That's correct. 57,000 words. That's a novella or even a short book. Aren't novellas short books? Anyway, it's a lot of words. My original missive was 555 pages, 167,000 words. My contract says no more than 95,000, but yeah, there's always a little wiggle room. So we're trying to get down to 110,000. At least I have to get down to 110,000. I took out an 800-word chunk this morning, and it was like that satisfying feeling when you kind of like peel off a scab. I know that's gross, but it kind of hurts, but also feels relieving and oddly good. It's okay. Like 4 of you listen this far. I'm sorry, Kelsey, for that image. My compost file for this book so far is 4,367 words of cut stuff. Some of it yummy. I'm close to 100 pages through the cutting. Hopefully I'll be close to that 57, maybe even 60,000 word limit. And then word cut limit. I'll have to go through one more time and then maybe do the thing where you find like one word in every sentence, like one instance of passive voice where you could take like 3 words and make it one. And that's pretty cool. It's like a magic trick. One pesky adverb. And then maybe I can find an extra 10,000 words without losing anything. This manuscript needs abs, man. And you do that by cutting the fat. I want a 5% body fat manuscript, man. But what sucks is that your rough draft, however bloated, it's still like following your taste. Like that's your instinct. And I know in my book proposal, I was asked to kind of like zhuzh up the writing. And when I struck that same tone, say, in this manuscript, I'm told, on the other hand, to stop being so zhuzhy. It's a tight wire act. You listen to some writers who are like, you got to try to be a bit in your face. Don't be so boring. Have some style. Write, enter. Like, enter. This, enter. And then you get a comment when you do that, when you mimic that, and the comment just says, no. And I get it. It's hard to write and serve so many different tastes. And how do you stay true to your taste when you get conflicting feedback from multiple sources that are like, stop doing this and you do this, and it's like, no, stop doing that. And it's really confusing. I'm more of a get out of the way kind of guy and let the story shine, but it's hard not to set off a few bottle rockets. It helps to have someone take away the bottle rockets and say, it's okay, B.O. You don't need these. It's also hard not to take things personally. Your instincts took you this far. And then you're told your instincts kind of suck. And you're 43 years old and you've been writing for 20 years and you've written 4 books, 1 published, 1 on the way, 1 hopes, and still you suck ass. So I guess it's always mitigating the ass sucking. There's an image. But you kind of get it, right? And it could be that even Margaret Atwood's rough drafts, or Isabel Wilkerson's rough drafts, or Bryn Jonathan Butler's rough drafts, or Elizabeth Rush's rough drafts all suck, like objectively suck. And it's ultimately on us to be a pro. Realize that whoever you've paid is looking to make your book as good as possible. They too are a pro. Some people are naturally better than others. Some people are starting with better field position than others. All we can hope is not to get too bogged down, not take things personally, and get better 1 book or 1 essay at a time. And you know I love to mix metaphors. So how many experiments in a test kitchen does it take to nail a recipe? Dozens? And we're talking from like accomplished chefs too. Like, are you a shitty chef because recipe 3 is not quite right? Like, no. As you become more seasoned, as a chef, you see that I'd probably get I'd get a comment right there. And anyway, you start from a better foundation of experience, so that maybe it takes fewer experiments to dial in that flavor. So maybe instead of 30 repetitions on a certain recipe, I don't know, it depends how ambitious you're trying to get. Maybe it takes 15. Because you're like, okay, I understand. I have a fundamental vocabulary that is better than it was the last book. That's writing, man. So stay wild, CNFers. And if you can't do, interview. See ya.